And we're recording. All right. How's everybody doing? It's the last day, huh? Been learning a lot? Soaking up some new info, hopefully, or reconfirming your own beliefs. Maybe today we'll do a little challenging of beliefs. Okay, let's start with who heard me speak on Thursday night? Thursday night? A few of you? Cool. Baby, will you check the camera? If I sit right here, will it see me? I feel like sitting. This just feels a little more comfortable. Can you still see me? Yeah. I'm going to adjust it a little. Thank you. Everybody make some noise for Pugsley. I know you've all been loving him. Cool. So a few of you said you heard me speak. Some of you haven't. So I'm going to do just a quick background recap. On Thursday, I only had 30 minutes. Today, I have an hour, so we're going to get to go a bit deeper. But I'll recap, thank you, baby, quickly what I covered. So for those who don't know who I am, my name is Derrick Broze. I've been an activist and an independent journalist for the last 15 years. And I produce documentaries. I encourage you to check out my 17-part documentary series called The Pyramid of Power at thepyramidofpower.net if you want to have your perspectives challenged. And my main website is The Conscious Resistance, theconsciousresistance.com, which is the place where I explore spirituality, the search for freedom and liberty, both of human and animals, and try to just get people around me and people around the world to think critically, to question systems of oppression, and that includes government, corporations, animal agriculture, etc. And as I said, I've been doing this for going on 16 years. I do a lot of public speaking. I've written a few books. We've got some shirts and books back there if you guys want to check it out. What I'm going to be covering today is coming from my most recent book, which is called How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State. You can download this for free if you don't want to get a physical copy, or if you're just curious, at theconsciousresistance.com/how-to. theconsciousresistance.com/how-to. There's a free PDF and a free audiobook if you prefer to listen instead. And of course, you can pick it up physically. So I've been doing this work going on, almost 2 decades. And I shared a bit about my background journey the other night. My first awakening, if you will, came originally from getting locked up at 20 years old. I got addicted to drugs right out of high school and in college, started drinking too much, started taking pills, started taking ecstasy, got hooked on crystal meth, and in 10 months I was locked up. And so actually 20 years ago, this November will be the anniversary of my arrest. And getting locked up and facing prison time was where I first kind of started doing a lot of my trauma healing. I started meditating, started kind of opening up spirituality. That was my first real awakening. Before I ever kind of started questioning any other sort of systems, it happened internally. And then when I got out, after it was all said and done, I'd done about 18 and a half months in Texas state prisons. I got out October 2008, and I was now a felon. And I still am technically a felon, but it just doesn't affect me anymore. But at that time, it very much affected me. I was just getting out. And for anybody who knows anything about the criminal justice system and being labeled a felon, sometimes we say you have an X on your back, a bullseye on your back, because you can't really get rented in certain neighborhoods and places. You can't get jobs certain places. People might judge you just because they hear that, and they're like, oh, felon, this might be a dangerous, violent person. And so I had to kind of navigate all that. And when I got out, and I was at the library all the time applying for jobs and just trying to figure out how I was going to make it, I started reading books about the drug war and the history of the drug war, and the fact that the roots of the American drug war really go back to big oil trying to drive out hemp, racism against black jazz musicians and Chinese migrant workers and Mexican migrant workers, and just some of the same interest we see in other areas who are trying to criminalize things like cannabis and other areas. And not to say, obviously, drugs have their own problems, but it was just a new kind of perspective that I hadn't heard in high school or in college or anywhere else. And that was really the first seed in my mind of like, maybe I haven't been taught the truth about some of the systems around me. Maybe I need to start questioning some of these things. And from then, it kind of began a journey of watching some documentaries, reading some books, and eventually I started an activist group in Houston, Texas, called the Houston Freethinkers. And we did a lot of good stuff, everything from the usual protests, marches, rallies, to building community gardens, urban farms, permaculture. I lived in an activist house for about 7 years, and we would host documentary screenings and art shows and community house shows, and it was just a wonderful, lovely time. And so the roots of everything I do come from that kind of activist background of wanting to reach people. And in that process, I kind of realized we had a few events. We'd like to throw festivals in Houston. At one of them, the Houston Police Department showed up 10 cars deep because somebody called the cops for a noise complaint on us. And they ended up arresting me, saying I refused to obey the orders of an officer. Long story short, when I got out of jail, we put out the video. The video went viral in Houston. All the news media showed up to interview us, and it was like it was an issue. It was on the evening news. Cops surround activists, because actually one of the cops pulled out a shotgun and pointed it at all of us, a crowd of unarmed people. And they all showed up after I got out of jail. We're very friendly. Hey, nice to meet you. Can we interview you? And then that evening and the next day, when the articles and the videos came out, their headlines were, "Local group of conspiracy theorists surround the cops." And it's like, oh, wow, so this is what the media does. This is how they act. And it was little things like that that started to kind of encourage me to think, well, maybe I could do this better than them. And I started to just get into journalism through an activist lens. First, just confronting the local mayor, going to local press conferences with my little handheld camera and being the only person in the room asking hard questions. And that has now become my day job. So as I said, I make documentaries, I write articles, try to just get people questioning systems around them. And a big chunk of my activism and my journalism has focused on digital surveillance and privacy, because I think privacy is intrinsically related to liberty. That once history shows, once governments and other institutions strip you of your privacy and you're not free in your own home, let alone your own thoughts, freedom goes pretty quickly after that, right? If you don't have the freedom to organize privately, to discuss ideas, it can go some bad places. And one of the main reasons I started to follow that path is because in my activism journey around 2012, I was leaked some images by a Houston Police Department officer who ended up being a source for me. And he showed me a classroom with a projector just like this, and on that projector screen it said the Houston Freethinkers with a picture of me on it. And there was about 4 or 5 cops sitting in there, and he passed it to another journalist friend and said, "Hey, if you know Broze, you should let him know they're making us attend training sessions on the Houston Freethinkers, and they're talking about them as if they're a militant group." And he said, he's like, "I looked them up, and all they're doing is building community gardens and doing this other stuff, but you should let him know he has an active criminal intelligence officer, like, following me around, I guess." So, and I lived in the city. I was biking everywhere I went, so I guess there was a cop following me around while I'm biking around doing activism. And then a couple months later, we had another confirmation, and we received another picture. And so when I, got that sort of gut check of like, wow, I'm definitely not doing anything illegal. I'm exercising my constitutionally protected rights to organize, and even if, people didn't agree with what we were doing, we weren't doing anything illegal. But it made me think, okay, if I'm under surveillance, I need to really understand, what does that even mean? What tools of surveillance exist? And so I started just diving deep down that rabbit hole. I started learning about Stingray cell phone surveillance tools. They're also known as cell site simulators. This is basically like a little laptop size tool that the cops can drive around, and they can scoop up all the data in your cell phones. And they typically say, well, we're just looking for one criminal in the neighborhood, but it's not targeted. So if you live in the neighborhood, they're gathering all your data at the same time. And they promise you they're not going to keep it or use it for any reason. But I learned about cell site simulators. I learned about facial recognition, voice detection technology, gait detection, which learns how you walk and can pick you out of a crowd. Just really started diving deep into all these tools. And of course, facial recognition, things like this. And it has sort of become one of my areas of expertise over the years that I focused on. And that largely led me to writing this book. So what I'm going to talk about today is why the vegan community should adopt what I call exit and build strategy. And I'm going to define those terms in just a moment. But I did want to throw out a couple of other terms to take a pulse of the room, because as I said on Thursday, I speak at a lot of different events, from libertarian, anarchist, freedom-minded events, to crypto events, to spiritual transformational events, to conspiracy theory events, and to vegan crowds. And I never like to assume that we all agree on everything just because we're here, right? So I just want to take a pulse, and if any of these following terms mean anything to you, positive or negative, please feel free to raise your hand. And this isn't a test. If you don't know the term, it's okay. I just want to see who's in the room. Does the term technocracy mean anything to you? Please raise your hand if it does. Cool. And again, if you don't know, I'm going to still define these terms. I just want to see who knows. The Great Reset. More hands on that one. That's a good sign. And again, good or bad, Agenda 2030. Some of you familiar with that? Okay, now this one. This is a good one. COVID 1984. Okay, a few hands on that. Okay, cool. All right. I ask these questions just because, like I said, it allows me to see who I'm speaking to and maybe which areas I don't need to explain and which I might need to. So, as I continued my journey of researching surveillance technology, I was paying attention to digital rights groups, law firms, and activists as far back as 2017 and 2018, going into 2019 when I started writing this book, that were warning almost a decade ago that facial recognition combined with artificial intelligence, which is now much more common than it was just 5 years ago when I wrote this, pose a very unique and dangerous threat to human liberty. Like I said, I mean, when privacy goes, liberty goes shortly after that. And so the concern, does everybody understand what I mean when I say facial recognition? Like you're talking about like a camera, or more increasingly if you've been flying lately, you're probably seeing these tablets at the airport they're asking you to stand in front of. They are optional. You can say no to them. They don't really tell you that, but you can say no. It's not illegal. You just say no, thank you, step aside, hand them your passport. So it's a camera, it can be a tablet, some sort of tool that will scan your face, and then what it does is compare that to a database. All kinds of companies and governments are using these. Again, I think that most of it is nefarious, but we are being sold the use of these tools and the normalization of these tools under a couple of different areas. The biggest one that we all fall prey to is convenience. It'll be very convenient. So, for example, you're starting to see these little stores, they're Amazon stores and others at the airport, and there's not a single human being in there. They say just sign up for our program, either scan your hand or scan your face, and walk in, grab whatever you want, and walk out. And what it's doing is scanning your face, connecting that to your bank account, your card, and automatically deducting the money. It's very convenient. You don't have to touch a dirty human being or talk to anybody. God forbid we actually interact with each other. And you just walk out of the store. And this is being tested more and more. You're going to see this, if you haven't yet, in the coming years. That's one way. Also, the National Football League, the NFL, I think it's half the stadiums across the country now have facial recognition entry. They're not even doing like physical tickets anymore. Like people get their faces scanned to enter. People who love football might not care so much about privacy. I'm not trying to generalize, but generally speaking, some people might be like, well, I want to play football if that means, I want to watch football if that means I got to scan my face. Who cares? I'm here to watch the team. So you're going to see it sold to us under convenience, entertainment. It's being used more and more in video games. You might see this with the kids' games where, there's the camera wants to scan their face and it makes, like, we can put your face on the avatar in the game. It's going to be sold all these different ways to make it normalized for us to accept our faces being scanned. And then, of course, through travel. They're claiming in the coming years it will be mandatory to fly and to do these sort of things. So facial recognition, though, has been warned about as if it becomes normalized, it allows governments and corporations with them to find ways to socially engineer society. And what I mean by that is the potential digital tyranny will be more subtle than we've seen it in the past. So let's say you talk about any totalitarian regime of the past, whether you want to, whatever names you want to throw out, communist, Nazi, etc. Those all involved guns, physical violence. A gun to your head, do what we say, or you're going up to the camp, or you're going to die. But if you remove that, and it's simply just a camera watching you all the time, that scans your face and knows everywhere you've been, knows every purchase you've made. And for those who were paying attention during COVID 1984, more and more people were being silenced on the internet. They were being canceled. They were being taken off PayPal. Their bank accounts were being shut. Is anybody familiar with the Canadian trucker protests? Whatever your feelings about it, you heard about it maybe? Well, people who were supportive of that, even if they didn't live in Canada and donated to those protests, some of them had their bank accounts canceled simply for supporting that protest. And so my point here is that the more interconnected these systems become, with things like facial recognition as well as digital IDs, this is another major threat. Again, these are all tools. We could imagine scenarios where they could be useful and used in positive ways. I'm focusing today on the ways that they are worrisome and potentially threats to our freedom and the coming generations, which is what matters most. So when you combine something like facial recognition with a digital ID that has your bank account information, your healthcare information, your social media, etc., and knows everywhere you've been, everything you've said online, everything you've spent, the people you hang out with, it can create a system that can allow governments to essentially lock you out. I'll give you another example. In China, where some of these systems are a bit more advanced, they already have, who's familiar with social credit scores? Heard of social credit scores? So like your typical credit score, it's related to your debt and whether or not you pay your bills back on time. Social credit score, as it sounds, is related to the way you interact with society, your social relationships, right? So In China, and it's being tested elsewhere, you are given a number assigned to you, just like a credit score, but it's your social credit score. So let's say he's one of these conspiracy theorists that's always posting these crazy theories on the internet. Well, that might cause his score to go down to a certain level. And maybe in the beginning you're like, who cares? It's some silly number. That doesn't affect me. Until you realize, as in China and elsewhere, that score determines whether you get a new job promotion, the rate of your insurance, and if it goes down a certain level, you lose right to public transportation because these systems are so interactive. So I'll give you a real-world example. During COVID, China had one of the worst lockdown policies. It was called the zero COVID policy, and it went on for years, well beyond any other nation. I mean, there were some pretty bad places, Australia and elsewhere, but even when those places let up, Chinese citizens were still locked in their homes in many cases. Well, a lot of the activists were starting to get sick of this, and they decided they were going to organize some protests. Unfortunately, they have what's called WeChat, which is kind of like their social media. But WeChat isn't just social media, it's also got your social credit score, it's got your bank information. It's what I call the one app to rule them all. It's got, everything in one, which again, sounds very convenient. Why should I have 10 different apps when I could just put it all in one? That's so much easier. And so when these activists started to organize, like, hey, we're going to go protest over here, it didn't take long for the Chinese government to find out about it, especially because they have one of the world's largest databases of facial recognition cameras in the world. As of 5 years ago, they publicly claimed they could find anyone in the country within 7 minutes. I would imagine it's much sooner now. So when these activists decided they wanted to jump on the buses and head to the protest, by the time they got to the buses, they had their cards, their digital ID had already been turned off. Because in a system like this, where you have to have a digital ID to get on a bus, you have to have a digital ID to get a job, you have to have a digital ID to get insurance, basically, the only way to exist is in the system. And in the system, they can control what you say, what you do, and penalize you if you have wrongthink, like 1984. So those activists weren't very successful. They tried to organize, but before they could even get on the public transportation to head to their locations, they tried to, sorry, denied, you're not allowed to enter. And the protests were ineffective. There's other countries. We recently went to Denmark to do some talks over there, and we were in a room just like this with activists who are very concerned because Denmark already has what they call My Digital ID. This digital ID is also required to get a job, to get insurance, to rent a home, to ride public transportation. And these Danish citizens are very concerned of where this is headed. They're worried well, what if I step out of line? Does that mean they're going to do the same thing they did in China? So I'm painting a picture here to you of the ways that these digital tools, namely facial recognition when combined with digital IDs, artificial intelligence, and then social credit scores is kind of one of the final pieces of it, how those can be used to socially engineer the behavior they want. Like I said, right, the gun's no longer in the picture. Instead, it's do what we say or you won't be able to interact with people in society. And then after a while, people will be like, okay, fine, I'll stop posting about that. I'll stop hanging out with those people. This is the other kind of more scary part about social credit scores, at least the way it is in parts of China. It's not only you that's affected. Like I said, maybe you don't care. Okay, they can turn my score to a 0 for all I care. I'm not going to, I don't ride the bus anyways. But it doesn't just affect you. It affects the people you hang out with. So let's say him and I are buddies and he keeps insisting on posting things online that the government doesn't like. Because they know where we're all at, they also know that I'm spending time with him. So not only is his score going down, but now I'm starting to get penalized for hanging out with one of these antisocial conspiracy theorists. And how long would it take, and we already saw this during COVID, unfortunately, where people were separating from their loved ones based on their health choices. How long would it take for somebody to say, man, I love you, but I got this job promotion coming up and I can't afford to lose any more points, so I'll see you in 6 months. I'll see you next year until things settle down. Because either that or you could stop posting, just stop doing these bad things. That's social engineering, right? The tyranny is way more subtle. There's no physical gun. It's all through these digital systems. And these are just realities. I'm not here to scare the crap out of anybody. These are just realities that I think we need to contend with as human beings, as vegans, just as people in general. So I say all that to say that's what led me to write this book. I started writing at the end of 2019 and we published it January 2020, about a month before we heard the word COVID-19. And unfortunately, some of the things that I wrote about happened during COVID. Digital IDs came in the form of vaccine passports that forced people to use them to travel, to go anywhere, things like that. And again, I'm not differences of opinion are all welcome here. Whatever your experience was during COVID, I know that for some of us, it was a tyrannical nightmare to watch the way governments handled it and the way that people were treated in different parts of the world. So in 2022, I added 5 new chapters based on everything we saw in COVID and based on what we learned. I believe the answer to what we're facing in terms of this potential digital dystopia is not going to come through politics, because through the United Nations and other organizations, nearly every single government of the world is already on board with rolling out digital IDs. Some are going to move faster than others. The Western nations are moving along pretty quickly. Australia, the UK, the US. Other places in the so-called global south, like Mexico, where we're living, are going to take a little bit longer. The infrastructure is just not there. Like parts of Southeast Asia, the idea of a digital ID being rolled out is just not going to be as effective. Doesn't mean they're not working on their own plans, because as I said, you could see every member state of the United Nations has plans for digital IDs in the coming years. And part of Agenda 2030 is that they want this plan to be completed by 2030. Will that happen in the next 5 years? Who knows? But that's definitely an objective that these countries have. Now, of course, it's important to understand that they don't say, we want to roll out digital IDs so we can control all people. They say, we want to roll out digital IDs because we want to help these poor Mexican and Indian farmers who are they don't have an ID, they're not part of the system. So if we just get them plugged into the system and get them into the banking system, their lives will be better off, we promise. I tend to doubt that that's where things are headed. I think it will end up where, it could end up where I'm describing. So when I wrote the book, it was part sort of call to action, as the title implies, how to opt out of the technocratic state, a little bit of history, which I'm going to share here in a moment, and most of all, practical steps on what I think people can do to, at the very least, start rethinking our relationships with technology. I'm not anti-technology by any means. I use technology every day for my work, for my journalism. But I do think we need to rethink our relationship. We don't have to accept every new update to the app. We don't have to accept every new rolling out of new tools, and just because it's convenient, because it's easy, because other people are doing it. I think we need to rethink that, the way we relate to these tools, and yes, use them in positive ways, use them in the ways we can to advance our causes and the things we believe in, and also be willing to say, you know what, I'm not going to participate in that system because I don't think that aligns with my values. And so I don't think we can rely on politics or politicians to stop these potential systems from rolling out. And obviously, apathy isn't the answer. Choosing to see what's happening and say, well, okay, whatever, I'm just going to worry about my family and kind of be in my little bubble and, let the world worry about itself. Well, personally, for me, we were taught through our indigenous teachers, to think about the 7 generations and beyond. So our children, their children's children, and the people after them who we're never going to meet. They are 100% depending on us to create the world that they're going to be born into. And it will either be a world where individual liberty and privacy are still valued, or it'll be a world where those things become a thing of the past, a relic of the past, and instead, we end up in a world where people can be penalized for their thinking, for what they post on the internet, and only that the correct thoughts are allowed. And I hope that that's not what you guys want. So I reject politics as the answer, and that's my personal approach. If you find ways to use politics to slow these things down, great, but I don't think it's the big picture. Apathy's not the answer, and obviously violence isn't the answer. This isn't a Hollywood movie where if we just go smash the big computer, everything stops and it's all over. It's a little more complex than that, right? And especially because in many ways, each of us here are voluntarily participating and are voluntarily giving up our own privacy by participating in these systems. But I do think there are solutions, and it's what I call exit and build. So that's what the title is about. And so I want to give you just a bit of background on where my ideas come from, and then we're going to talk about how we can apply this concept of exit and build holistically. And this is what I touched on Thursday, but we're going to go deeper. First, though, I'd like to, you guys still with me? Is this making sense? Yeah. Cool, thank you guys. I'd like to define that term, technocratic. I mentioned technocracy earlier and a few people's hands went up. So for those who don't know, technocracy, it was and continues to be a political philosophy that was mostly popular in Canada and the United States in the 1930s and 1940s. And so just like we have democracy, demo meaning people, rule by the people, this is rule by technology, or more specifically, technocrats. And what the technocrats called them, what they believed themselves to be, were the engineers, the experts, scientists, And essentially it started in Columbia University. There was this man named William Scott, and there was a few other gentlemen who were studying, this is after the Great Depression, and they're sort of looking at society at large. And they're like, politics doesn't seem to be working. The capitalist business class don't seem to be fixing things. So what else is there? And they said what we should do is we should abolish voting and abolish political parties. We should abolish the business class, and instead you should have rule by technocrats. And so these were mostly engineers and scientists were the experts, which, you know, if you think about the COVID years, trust the experts was a pretty popular phrase, right? The response to COVID was very much a technocratic response in terms of politicians don't know what they're doing. Trust, it was the doctors in this case. But when it came to the original technocrats, they had this whole system imagined where, again, voting wouldn't take place, the capitalist business class wouldn't have a role. They said they would use the machines, which I think in 2025 we would probably call AI. But back then they said, the technocrats will use the machines, and these machines will be able to perfectly allocate resources to all people in all places. Now, that sounds maybe great, but like most people who sell utopias, it also does involve a loss of individual choice, individual liberty, and the sort of things that I'm concerned about. And that's not even me speculating. If you go back and read the original technocrat, you can find their workbooks and handbooks and stuff. They admitted that you would probably need a global police force to enforce this because some people are not going to want to go along with it. But we promise you it's going to be good for everybody. They talked about energy credits that would track how much energy every person uses, and the machines would perfectly allocate so to make sure you get the right amount of food and this country gets this right amount of food. And they wanted to create what they called the North American Technate, which would encompass Mexico, US, Canada, Greenland, and Panama, which interestingly, Donald Trump wants to buy Panama and Greenland, and so I don't know, make of that what you will. But it's a historical movement. In fact, it actually grew so big at one point. You can find photos in New York City. They had this giant march with thousands of people in the streets of New York City, and the technocrats like to dress in this very drab, gray military uniforms, just completely without color, which I think is symbolic of their movement. And it had a lot of supporters. In fact, Elon Musk's grandfather, Joshua Hazelman, was part of the original technocrat movement in Canada, and he had some legal trouble related to that. You can go find out about that history. And he was part of something called the Social Credit Party. So the official version of events, if you go look at Wikipedia, for example, it'll say this movement had its moment and then it died down and it went away and died, into the dustbin of history. But in reality, this movement has never gone away. I think it's continued to influence various so-called elite and politicians and people who like to think that they run the world since the 40s and since the 50s. And I'll give you one little other piece of history for those who like to dive down these rabbit holes. In the 1970s, a man named Zbigniew Brzezinski, has anybody heard his name? He was an advisor to presidents from Jimmy Carter through Barack Obama. He died a few years ago. And I would consider him to be a very shady person definitely somebody to learn about and his influence. But in the 1970s, he wrote this book called America Between the Two Ages, the Technotronic Era. So instead of the word technocratic, he said technotronic. But essentially, it was a revival of the same ideas. Again, he talked about you would need a world police state to enforce this. You would probably have to suppress free speech because some people would be complaining and not liking it, but they promise in the end it's going to lead to a utopia where everything is perfectly allocated, all resources are evenly distributed, and we use technology to take America to the golden age. So these ideas have been around, and then in terms of 2025, the technocrats of today, because I want you guys to really be able to visualize what I mean by a technocrat. This is somebody who's not elected to government office, but they have wealth, they have technology, and they can use that wealth and that technology and that influence to achieve the goals they want, whether or not anybody voted on it, right? Now think about the big tech leaders of today. Bill Gates, Zuckerberg, Bezos, Elon Musk. Is anybody familiar with the name Peter Thiel? A few of you, more of you should learn who Peter Thiel is in the company Palantir. These are people who are very deeply tied to the current White House. And this isn't a left-right thing. I reject both parties. They're both full of crap and they're both part of this. It just happens to be that currently the current party in power is very much embracing this technocratic philosophy. So using his wealth and influence, just as one example, somebody like Bill Gates can promote and fund programs for geoengineering the weather. Is anybody familiar with geoengineering? That's a whole nother rabbit hole we won't get into. The point is, geoengineering is the idea that we should use various technologies, and there's several different types, but the one most people are familiar with and concerned about is called stratospheric aerosol injection, which involves spraying various aluminum and strontium and barium out of the back of planes in order to reflect sunlight to fight climate change. Nobody voted on these ideas. No government has officially approved them, but people like Bill Gates, using his money and his influence and working with Harvard, have been able to fund programs like that. So that's kind of an example of how technocracy could work. The people don't have a say, but the people with the power and the technology are able to guide these programs. So my point with all this, sharing all this history, is that this philosophy is not some obscure thing that is irrelevant. It still continues to influence our world, and probably more than it did in the 1930s. 100 years later, it seems to be very much guiding what we're talking about. So when I wrote this book, I was both warning not only about the rise of digital surveillance and facial recognition and stuff like that, but the fact that there is a philosophy behind it that is guiding these people, that believes that the average people like us are too dumb to really know what's best for us, and we need technocrats with their AI and with their tools to micromanage society, and they promise us that it's going to be for the best of all of our futures. I think we have good reason to be skeptical of that. Yeah, 20 minutes? Wow, that was fast. Okay. You guys good? We're going to go into solutions now. Okay. So this leads me to, is it still on? Cool. This leads me to the solutions. As I said, everything I just shared is kind of taken from this book. It goes a little more in depth, but that's the history. This is what we're facing. This is the philosophy behind it. These are the dangers of the digital tools. What do we do about it? That's the most important thing. Now, I came to this event specifically to share this message with vegans, because I think that while vegans are importantly and amazingly focused on animal liberation and protecting animals and animal welfare and all these concepts, that we might be missing the forest for the trees, and seeing that, well, if we only focus on protecting the animals, which I think is part of a holistic liberation movement, but we don't also focus on how we are going to keep ourselves free, well, we're not going to be able to help the animals very much if we're not free, right? If we're not free ourselves. So my work was greatly inspired by a man named Samuel Edward Konkin III. He was a Canadian activist who lived in the United States, and he went to Wisconsin University. He was very active in the 1960s student movements. He witnessed all the sort of great uprisings and protests of the 60s, and by the end of the decade, by the 1970, he started working on his first book, his main book. And like me, he was saying, he's like, I don't think politics is going to lead where we want to get. I don't think violence is going to get there, and apathy is definitely not going to get there. But he envisioned a future, a place where we could get, where we would have freedom of all kinds, and I think freedom for animals as well, the freedom to discuss ideas, the freedom to exchange goods, the freedom to live how we want as long as we're not causing harm to other beings. And he took inspiration from the Greek marketplace, which was called the agora, or the agora. And so he called his philosophy agorism, because he envisioned one day we're going to get to this place, this agora, where we're all free to live how we are, how we want, where we all recognize that we are free, powerful, beautiful people, and so long as we are not using force, fraud, coercion, or violence on each other, we should be free to live as we want. That doesn't mean we all need to agree on everything. In fact, I don't want to agree with everybody on everything. I think that'd be kind of boring. I like being around other people with different opinions and views. But as long as you're not trying to force your views on me, we can have a discussion, we can agree to disagree. So he was seeing that in the distance. Okay, I see that potential vision out there, but how do we get there, right? How do we actually get from here to there? And what he believed, after studying the collapse of the Soviet Union, as well as other parts of the world where governments had increasingly become tyrannical, he noticed that there was a natural state of humans. When governments or corporations or any entity gets more tyrannical, inevitably people react, we step away, whoa, I don't want to be a part of that, and we find ways around it. And he noticed that even in the Soviet Union, when things were getting more and more oppressive, there was a thriving black and gray market where even if it was illegal to say trade, to have more bread than you were allocated, distributed by the government, there was a black market where you could go buy more bread, where even the guards were secretly buying and exchanging goods in the black market. And he took inspiration from that, and looking at places like India and the global south as well, where the alternative underground economy, he called it the counter economy, is huge. And he said, well, what would happen if we actually activated the consciousness of the people and encouraged them to step out of this mainstream economy and to participate or to build counter economies, alternative economies, parallel economies, outside of the government's hands, outside of the corporation's influence, and focus on the building of that. And he believed that in his book, he goes deep into like the stages he believed humanity would pass through as we slowly people start to exit from these systems, and over time they get more complex. We start having alternative transportation models, alternative food distribution and production models, et cetera, and then at some point in the future, he believed, the government and the corporations' influence would become weaker and weaker, and then we would jump to these new alternative systems, and hopefully those systems would be more aligned with our values. If you're interested, I encourage you to check out his book. It's called The New Libertarian Manifesto. It was written in 1971. Unfortunately, a lot of the things he predicted he did not come to see because he died in 2004. He wasn't vegan and he didn't take care of himself. In fact, I'm working on a biography about him, and I talked to some of his old friends who are still alive, and they said he was known for eating a massive hamburger called the heart attack burger, which coincidentally he had a heart attack. So he didn't understand the thinking of holistic. He had the message, but he didn't understand the importance of taking care of your health. That's one lesson I take from that. So when I discovered his work in 2010, 2011, I was early in my activism, and again I was like, well, what can we do? I don't think politicians are going to save me, and I know that violence isn't the answer, but I feel this passion. How do I help build new systems or help get to the world that I know is possible? I discovered his work and this idea of building parallel economies and parallel systems. And I continue to work in this area. And there are now tools that allow us to do this. I'm not a huge, diehard supporter of Bitcoin these days, but when it first came out, it presented this opportunity for a revolutionary technology which was not controlled by the government, which was not controlled by the banks. And the original people in the Bitcoin community very much saw it as sort of revolutionary money. Like, hey, we can have money to exchange with each other, and governments can't control that, banks can't control that. That's a powerful idea. It has kind of changed in most of the ethos behind it, but the general idea is still there. So I started to embrace a lot of these ideas and really tried to live this. And when I wrote this book, I was inspired by Konkin's ideas, and I started calling it Exit and Build. And what I mean by that is that we recognize there are systems that don't align with our values. For most of us here, the animal agriculture system, the factory farming system. We choose to exit from those systems. We don't buy meat and we don't buy their products, and instead we support local farmers where we can. We're eating, vegan, things like that. So you're exiting from one system, and you're either building or supporting those who are building these alternative systems, right? So you're all already doing it. It's kind of like taking that idea of voting with your dollar, but instead of just applying it to literal dollars and economics, applying it to every area of your life. Start to take what I call a holistic self-assessment, looking at the different systems that you participate and figure out in which ways am I out of alignment. It's not meant to be like, hey, look at you, you're living wrong. It's meant to be like, well, this is a wake-up moment. I claim to be a positive person who has these certain values and principles, but when it comes to this area, I'm actually supporting some things that go against my values. Okay, that can be a wake-up call. That's a moment to say, okay, how can I find a way to move away from those systems? And I gave some examples the other day that I'm going to quickly run through again. The other day I talked about banking, the media, big tech, education system, the food, and then government itself. I'm going to touch on a couple of these here. The financial system is one I think is extremely important, because whatever your opinions on money or any of that sort of thing, the current financial systems as they stand, no matter which country you come from, are all built on central banking, fractional reserve banking. They're all debt-based. And this is hugely problematic. And they're also inflationary. So this is why the dollars in your pocket are getting worth less as we sit here every moment. And it's not that the eggs are getting, or the vegan alternative eggs or the veggies are getting more expensive. It's that your money is getting worth less over and over, because that's built into the systems. And so people are constantly scraping by, constantly having to catch up, constantly trying to just make it. Even if you're rich, your money is constantly losing value. And I also gave some examples the other day that no matter what bank you're currently using, we could search right now on a non-Google search engine and find crimes that those banks are associated with. Whether you want to talk about Bank of America, JP Morgan, Chase, etc., all the banks that robbed the American people in 2008 and 2009, and it's just like, why would we still want to give them our money? Why would we want to support Goldman Sachs, etc.? HSBC, involved in human trafficking and money and drug trafficking. Chase, involved with helping Jeffrey Epstein launder his money through for his victims, to pay off his victims. We could go on and on and on. To me, those banks and those systems do not deserve your money. They don't deserve your time. They don't deserve your support, mental, physical, or spiritual. And that you would be better served in going and doing a search and finding the local credit union in your area. Now, at the end of the day, that's a step in the right direction. This is what I talk about in the book. You're not going to go from totally plugged into the matrix, I've got credit card debt, student debt, I've got, I'm full on with big tech and I'm eating unhealthy, to being the opposite overnight. It's a process, right? So don't get overwhelmed by it. But if you can see, this is where I'm at now, and that's the goal. That's the agora. That's living healthy. That's being unplugged. That's using alternative currencies, whatever it may be. Start taking steps. And in my book, I talk about how to develop a 6-month to a 1-year plan to make this happen. Because I get it. Some people might be like, yeah, Derrick, but I've got all this automatic withdrawal and all my accounts are connected there. It's going to take me so long. And I usually say, well, if that's about as much as you're willing to do, then maybe you don't actually want to live in line with your values. It's just like when you try to talk to somebody about being vegan and they're like, yeah, but that sounds like so much work. I don't know, where am I going to get my protein? All these kind of, questions and complaints that we know it's worth it because the animals deserve it, right? And in these other areas, the planet deserves it, we deserve to live in line with our values, and I don't think we're ever going to get to that better world that we know is possible until we, in our own hearts and our own bodies, actually start living in line with those values. It's one thing to shout at the world and tell them to live the way you want. It's a whole other thing to say, am I even doing that? Maybe I should look in the mirror, right? So you start with switching over to a credit union. And if you are interested in things like crypto, which again, I don't think is perfect, but there are alternative private currencies, maybe you start exploring that. Maybe you're interested in precious metals like gold and silver. Maybe you start your own paper currency. Whatever it is, the point is you start trying to see an exit path to being part of these alternative systems. The food production system, most of you here are already, I think, probably good on that front because you're vegan or vegan curious. But it's not just about veganism, because you could be vegan and still participating in destructive food systems. This is why I'm so glad that Paul and others have mentioned permaculture throughout this weekend, because I really believe permaculture is the answer. And for us, everything I'm sharing with you guys, I'm not just like talking to you without doing these. I haven't used a bank since 2008. I don't talk to certain government agencies. We have land in Mexico. We have a farm that we're building out there. Everything I'm sharing with you are things that I am doing myself, and I'm trying to embody that, because I think that's the only way we can really teach anybody, is to lead by example, right? You can talk all day, you can post on social media, you'll get some people, you'll maybe preach to the choir, but the way you reach people who aren't converted yet is you show them. You embody it, you live it, and that's what inspires people. So everything I'm sharing with you are things that I am currently practicing or attempting to do. So learn about permaculture, learn about the local farms in your area. I'm sure if you live here in Kansas, there's plenty of farms around, but no matter where you're from, search out the farmers markets. Go visit those farmers markets, support them, buy directly from the farmers, ask them if you can visit the farms and get to know, the way they're doing veganic permaculture and the way they're growing their food using permaculture. Learn about those systems, and if you have a little bit of, earth to tend and steward, take care of it and put permaculture into practice. That's exiting from one system and supporting and building better systems. Health. This was a big one, again, during COVID. A lot of people started to realize that maybe I don't want to just trust these mainstream healthcare systems that are very much influenced and funded by Big Pharma. Maybe I want to take my own health into my own hands. And I'm not here to give you medical advice or anything like that. I think the point is, we've learned that we can't just blindly trust the experts and expect to be taken care of. We all understand. There was a great presentation earlier about veganism and how it relates to health, and how many myths there are from the mainstream pharma-funded or institutions, which tell people that meat is wonderful and it's not going to cause you any issues, it's not going to clog up your arteries, all this kind of stuff. So we already understand it on one level, that we can't blindly trust those systems, but maybe we need to take that to an even deeper level. The point is, you're recognizing this system doesn't align with your values, you're exiting from that system, you're supporting those who are building new systems, or you're building them yourself. And another one I'll mention as I start to wrap up here is technology. This one is, I did touch on this a little bit the other day, but I think this one is so key because we all live in such a digital world now, and the vast majority of everybody in this room has a phone in their pocket right now. It's probably radiating your boobs or your testicles right now, so turn it off or take it out. Just throwing that one out there. That's a whole other area we need to explore in the vegan community. EMFs, the dangers of that, and how much we embrace that. I've got a documentary out called The 5G Trojan Horse on my website if you want to learn more about that. But we're all using digital tools, and again, we believe that we're ethical, righteous people, And yet we're using Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc. And I'm not here to shame anybody. They've monopolized the industry. It's not easy to find the alternatives. The alternatives do exist though, but just like you have to look for alternative information and not trust what the mainstream says about meat and veganism, you have to look for the alternatives when it comes to technology. I mentioned some websites the other day, I'm going to mention again today. I have a good buddy, his name's Hakeem Anwar. He lives in Texas, and his company is called Above. The website's abovephone.com. And they sell a de-Googled, anybody can learn to de-Google a phone, but most people don't have the time or energy to do it. If you want to do it, great, do it. What they do is they've made it really simple and convenient. So they sell de-Googled phones, so all the Google spyware is stripped out of there, and they load them with their own privacy-based open source operating system. It's called the Above OS. And everything that you use right now, there's an alternative. Baby, hold it. Miriam's got one right now. Look, it looks just like a regular phone, but there's no Google Maps on there. There's Magic Earth. There's Organic Maps. There's no YouTube on there. There's NewPipe. And you can, what's the podcast one? She loves listening to podcasts like many of us. AntennaPod. So she uses the AntennaPod app, and instead of having a Spotify account, which is taking her data, and also Spotify censors creators, and Spotify is now investing in some of the hardware that's being used in Israel and elsewhere, instead of participating in those systems, an app like AntennaPod allows you to find any podcast you want to listen to and subscribe to it without being logged in, without giving them your data, and most importantly, you can actually download it so you're not dependent on streaming, so you can actually hold it, because that's a whole other part of the PSYOP, is getting us to be on subscription model services. Sign up for Netflix and pay it monthly, sign up for Spotify. Don't actually own physical media, don't actually own it on your own device. The point is, everything you're already doing, these phones offer an alternative, an open source, privacy-based alternative. AbovePhone.com. They also do laptops, they have an email service, and I'm not paid for this or anything. This is just things that we're using, and I want more people to know about that. And I mentioned this, and again, this is not a shade on the organizers here or any other organizers here, but most of the time when I get invited to events, people are using Google Docs to organize, they're using Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and again, there's a lot of problems with these big tech companies, but there are alternatives. The one we use to organize all of our documentation for our event is called CryptPad. CryptPad.fr is the one that we use. And so just like Google's got Sheets, Docs, uploads, all the tools you're using right now, there's alternatives to that, but they're encrypted and they're open source. A good website to check out if you just want a list of alternatives to Gmail and everything that Google's doing is nomoregoogle.com. And then another one is privacytools.io. And then one that I just learned about the other day is called libertytools.io. And I'm not paid by any of these people. I don't know them personally. They're just resources I've found in my journey. And please do your own due diligence when you, let's say you find another email. Check it out for yourself. Don't just say, oh, well, Derrick said this is good. Do your own research. The point is, these alternatives do exist. But when you walk into the local Best Buy, you're not going to find the Above phone. You're not going to find the Above laptop. You're not going to find Linux-based open source systems, because there is a monopoly in that tech world. But what about us not only fighting for the animals and trying to be about animal liberation and animal welfare, but thinking holistically and trying to remove ourselves from oppressive systems all around, whether that's financial, whether that's health, whether that's technology. And I know this is a lot of what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight, but I believe that we are all capable of doing this. I think it just takes a certain, just like we care for the animals and we're willing to make choices, or, who's been in a situation where you'd rather not eat than, starve for a couple of days because if to eat would mean not being vegan. Like you're like, hey, you know what, I'm going to fast for the next couple of days. So you're willing to make a sacrifice, right? Because you believe in this principle. Then maybe we need to be willing to make sacrifices and hard choices in other areas so that we can live in line with our values. That's basically what I'm calling for here. And I think I'm probably about to be out of time here in a moment. Let me see, a couple minutes, cool. So yeah, that's kind of my final point, is that what I'm talking about is essentially thinking holistically. I started talking about the bigger picture of digital surveillance and digital privacy because I wanted you guys to really see where my ideas were originally from. Like, I do think that is a major concern, that vegan or non-vegan, we all need to be worried about. But I think this idea of exit and build doesn't only apply to exiting from systems like, so for example, when we fly home to Mexico on Tuesday, I'm going to opt out of the facial recognition. And the guy's going to be like, you know that there's cameras everywhere, as he always does. And I tell him, yeah, that may be true, but while I have the right to say no, I'm going to exercise that right. Because privacy and liberty is a muscle, and if we don't flex it, we will lose it. So I don't care what this silly guy thinks, or if he's like, oh my God, now I have to actually do a little work. I'm going to do it, right? And unfortunately, when we do it, we're the only people doing it. 99% of the people in the airport are, and I'm kind of walking through the line, it's optional. You don't have to do this. People are looking at me a little crazy because they post signs, but the sign is about this big and it's after you've already walked through it. Yep.
Do you opt out of
the body scanners? Yeah, we do. Yeah, we opt out of the body. I've been opting out of the body scanner since 2010.
This flight on the way here.
Oh, it's well, we learned a new trick. Pugsley's the trick, because apparently this is our first time with Pugsley as our service dog, and so they don't let the dogs go through the body scanner. So they had her go through the metal detector, and here's another little one, if you don't mind telling a little fib. I have a torn shoulder, it is true, but I could lift it. But if they ask you to go in there, you could of course opt out, which is what I usually do. But you might notice if you opt out of the body scanner, these people are in no desire to move quickly for you. In fact, they might make you miss your flight. I've been in that case where I'm like, oh my God, I have to go. And they're like, yeah, we'll get somebody in a minute. I think they've been trained to literally just kind of let you sit there and do nothing. But if you're going to walk through the body scanner, you're like, I have a shoulder injury, I can't lift my arm. Then they just make you go through the metal detector. Pro tip, use it if you want.
Can you maybe say a little bit about what you know about the type of radiation that the scanners have and why it's bad?
I could, yeah. So it's millimeter wave technology, and again, if you go look on Wikipedia and some other sources, they'll tell you that it's perfectly harmless. I don't think that's what the data bears out. I do cover that in my documentary, The 5G Trojan Horse. Now, that's not to say that you're not being exposed to other things, because we get exposed to radiation on the flight as well. So I've heard some people say, well, you're opting out of that, but you're going to go take a flight. But I don't have an option in that case, right? I can't put myself in a Faraday cage on the plane. So to me, and again, somebody like the guy, the customs agent, he makes the joke. He's like, well, why do you want to opt out of this facial recognition? You know we've got cameras everywhere. And some people will say that, or the common thing that we've heard since 9/11. Well, if you've got nothing to hide, then blah, blah, whatever. But you don't have to have anything to hide. And also, here's another trick. Next time somebody tells you that they don't really care about privacy and they have nothing to hide, ask them to hand you their phone. And you'll see how quickly they care about privacy. Because to some level, we all do care about privacy, right? Doesn't mean you're doing anything illegal, but maybe you got your personal thoughts or you got some nudes or whatever it is. You don't want people to see it. That's your business, right? But people have been conditioned to think that it's weird to exercise privacy, and that's why when we go in there, also again, COVID was a huge training step. Stand stand on the 2 feet on the ground in front of the tablet. That's what they do in the airport. They just have people stand there, and nobody even thinks about it. Just for a moment, they're just, yeah, and you go. And we're the weird ones standing off to the side. Here you go, here's my passport. But yeah, I got time for a couple questions. Let me just say one more thing. Yeah, I think you guys got it. Let's just think holistically, right? Veganism is one piece of the puzzle, and it's an important piece, but I don't think it's the end goal, the end of the puzzle in terms of liberation and building a better world. And just to bring it back home, this isn't about us, guys. This is about helping the coming generations. And we were taught to stand for the 7 generations. And also, every single one of us, no matter what your skin color, your place of birth, your first language, all of our ancestors had to go through blood, sweat, and tears to get us here, right now in this moment, to be living in this comfortable place, in this comfortable time that we are. And for me, fighting for the future and fighting for a better world is about fighting for the coming generations, but it's also about honoring my ancestors that came before me. Because I believe if we choose to see the world that is being built ahead of us, and we choose not to do everything and anything we can in our ability, we're not only selling out those coming generations, but we're selling out our ancestors who worked so hard to get us here. So, thank you guys.